The first instance now of these clouds is to be found in a film dating from 1934. I'm speaking of the opening scene of Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, which documents the Nazi Party rally of that year held in Nuremberg. It's not exactly the opening scene, however, because as you'll see, there's a kind of prologue that precedes it, which I will also spend a certain amount of time discussing. So maybe we can show then the prologue and the part of the first scene, not the entire first scene, of Triumph of the Will. 3. So if any of you are interested in seeing how it turns out, speaking of how it turns out, I don't think I mentioned this in this talk, but if any of you have seen Judgment at Nuremberg by Stanley Kramer with Burt Lancaster in the role of an accused Nazi official, it begins with a dynamite, the very first scene of that eagle that we see. So it's a kind of both a response and a tribute to his predecessor, I think, and I interpret it that way. This eagle, which occurs. It's a nice movie. Okay. Riefenstahl's film, together with Olympiade, made 2 years later at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, are almost universally characterized and classified as propaganda films. Riefenstahl herself rejected this characterization, pointing out that in her films there is no voice off telling viewers what they should think or how to respond. There were simply the images and sounds of what was being filmed, accompanied by a musical score. Now, it's true that the musical accompaniment obviously contributes powerfully to producing an ambience, which in turn profoundly influences and indeed often dictates the way the images are understood by the spectator. The influence of such musical accompaniment is all the more effective for passing under the radar of our conscious control. We're generally far less aware of the music than we would be of a spoken discourse. However, I find her remark, just parenthetically, about the voice off extremely interesting. And if you, for example, think of the voice off in the nightly news, the television news, and if you compare cases, for example, where you see images without a voice off telling you what you think, for example, the last 5 minutes each hour of Euronews, where you have no comment, for instance, you see how important the voice off actually is. And it's also something you tend not to think about because it's very often the voice off. It's not for nothing that the presenter of the news, nightly news, is called in American English an anchor person. Because that the presence of the image and voice of the speaker anchors what otherwise could, I would interpret as an uncontrolled or a much more ambiguous chain of signification that could be attached to the images. Okay. So this is not an uninteresting response on the part. Nevertheless, then it remains accurate that the only voices heard in the film are those of the participants. The speeches of Hitler, Hess, other Nazi dignitaries are carefully edited, of course. This means that if there is a propagandistic element to this film, it has to consist in the images and sounds rather than in an invisible and transcendent voice telling viewers what those images and sounds really mean. There is, however, a partial exception to this rule, a significant one, and it comes right at the outset in the credits, as it were, that introduce and frame the film. This English term, credits, however, hardly does justice to what in German is called the Vorspann, and what in French is known as the générique. I prefer the latter term because despite its utilitarian meaning, that of listing the people, the genre, générique, involved in the production of the film, the word can also suggest that what comes before the film proper, in a certain sense introducing it, also can generate the film, générique, by framing the context in which it is intended to be seen. Now, although the générique or prologue does not involve a voice in Riefenstahl's film, it makes explicit use of writing and inscriptions and the image of writing and inscriptions, indeed of typography, in order precisely to introduce the film and to set the scene. The film begins significantly not with an image, this you could barely see because the room isn't dark enough and it goes very quickly, but the film begins with the negation of an image and visibility, with a black screen that's there for about 2 seconds. The first thing that you see is a black screen. It's dark. which can also be interpreted as representing night or darkness. Throughout the film, however, the play of light and dark, the emergence of the one out of the other and its passage into the other, turns out to be one of the most salient hallmarks of the film, visually. But this dark black screen doesn't last for long. It functions as an introduction and contrast, as a transition to what is to come. After barely a second or two, this darkness slowly lightens, allowing a figure to gradually emerge, that of an ego, sculpted in stone, perched on something, the camera is descending, that at first is not recognizable, but that in the seconds that follow the descent of the camera is silhouetted against a background consisting of bright clouds quickly moving across the sky. These clouds thus do not obscure sight, but rather provide a bright background that sets off the massive figures of the ego perched on a wreath, which in turn encloses the Nazi symbol par excellence, the swastika. Already in these initial seconds, then, the viewer is confronted with a set of contrasts that will pervade the film as a whole. Between dark and light, between stasis and motion, between the visible and the invisible. Of these contrasts, it's the one between stasis and motion that is perhaps the most significant, because in a certain sense it's presupposed by all the others. The rally that Riefenstahl is filming is one not just of a political party, but of one that always referred to itself as a political movement, Bewegung. Riefenstahl, who asserted that she had introduced the traveling shot into the documentary film here, was in any event fully aware of the importance of movement and of the fact that such movement had to include that of the camera and of the spectator. Her films were designed to move their viewers, and to do this, they both depicted certain kinds of movement from a perspective that itself was highly mobile. The scene that we just cut out there at the end then shows the procession of the Führer through the crowds, and often with the camera behind as well as on the side. So you have different shots of the movement, the camera being part of the movement as it was in the plane, but looking over the shoulder, as it were, of Hitler. And then cameras placed elsewhere to watch the going by, the relation of the crowd and so on. This relation between movement and stasis, between change and duration, also pervades the film, both in what it shows, in the way the camera itself moves, and in the speeches of the participants. But all of this movement is framed at the outset by the manner in which the credits are presented, or the film introduces, not just credits. This introductory framing consists then of 3 sections, lasting about 30 seconds each and separated by fade-outs. The first we've just described, it proceeds from the dark screen to progressively illuminated ego perched on a wreath framing the swastika, and then finally, in a descent, descending to the title, Triumph of the Will. The inscriptions are all carved out of stone, as if set on a wall, which in turn is made up of large square blocks. The inscriptions are in semi-Gothic letters, the materiality of which is emphasized by shadows that they cast on the wall that is their support. The notion of a 1,000-year Reich, although nowhere mentioned explicitly in the film, is thus suggested by this massive stone lettering, which is, as it were, designed to withstand the passage of time. But in fact, there are 2 kinds of fading in this first section. The fading of one image into the next, establishing a continuous transition, and then the fading into a black screen that separates the sections from each other. So within a section you have kind of fading black, one image to the other, and between the sections, the black screen. This fading to black can be interpreted as the interpolation of the interval required to separate individual elements from one another. The images are, of course, related and therefore not isolated in the Freudian sense, but the fading gives each segment a relative independence and autonomy. Each image inscribed in stone letters is intended to withstand the test of time. These images, beginning with those of the inscriptions, are designed to last. This temporal dimension then emerges clearly in the second and third sections of this introductory sequence, both of which then unfold and name a certain history. First, the history of the film itself. Riefenstahl calls it a document, as in documentary. It's been called into being, quote, at the behest of the Führer, im Auftrag des Führers. Unfortunately, we didn't have the subtitles there. But I'm going to quote it so that you see that the film document is made im Auftrag des Führers, at the behest of the Führer, which gives it, of course, a special privilege and proximity with respect to what is being filmed. But the next screen announces that the film, which has been called into being, as it were, by the Führer, has been shaped by Leni Riefenstahl. That's where her name appears. The English subtitle, which you didn't see, uses the more familiar word created by Leni Riefenstahl. But the German is more precise and more limited. In German, it's gestaltet from Leni Riefenstahl. The word Gestalt is significant, for it does not imply a creatio ex nihilo, or in this case, a creation emanating strictly from the artistic creator, but rather a shaping that gives form and figure to a material that already exists, and in this case emanates from the task assigned by the Führer. Now, much has been written about this notion of Gestalt, especially in the wake of Heidegger, who sees in the term an essential aesthetic concept contributing to the metaphysical forgetting of the ontological difference between being and beings. For Heidegger, the word suggests something that is constituted independently of time and history, and that can determine the course of both. A similar claim seems to be inscribed in the stone-like lettering of these credits, which seek thereby to accredit the idea of a title and a name that will be impervious to temporal change, and that will also contribute to channeling and directing the course of history. The four screens that constitute the third and final section of the introduction deploy the immediate historical sequence in which the film and the events it documents situate themselves. This is done through a series of dates, beginning with September 5th, 1934, the first day of the Party Congress. Heidegger assimilates the notion of Gestalt to a metaphysical tradition that construes being, above all, in terms of the third-person singular, present, indicative, reducing its resources to simple self-presence of the is. Riefenstahl's dating confirms that reduction by situating the moment in which the Party Congress begins with respect to datable historical antecedents. The first of these dates is described as 20 years after the outbreak of the World War. The second locates the rally 16 years after the start of German suffering, that is the Treaty of Versailles. And finally, as though to indicate the acceleration of historical time, the years change to months, 19 months, after the beginning of the German rebirth, marked by a shift also in musical accompaniment to a kind of pseudo-Wagnerian swelling brass fanfare, i.e. 19 months after the naming of Hitler as Chancellor on January 3rd, 1933. 19 months after that date, and also after all the other dates, another arrival, another event is going to be shown, which is this time that of Hitler arriving by plane in Nuremberg. Now, before we proceed to that sequence, it should be noted that the tripartite division of the historical process leading up to the 34-party Congress can be, I believe, usefully compared to the tripartite division of the Christian salvational narrative, in German Heilsgeschichte. If the latter consists of first creation, then fall, and finally redemption, 20th century German history, as announced in this film, traces a similar pattern, formally at least, with several illuminating changes. In place of the creation of the world, there is the world at war. In place of the fall, there is the defeat and the suffering that it introduced, a certain type of peace treaty. And finally, in place of resurrection, there is rebirth through the coming to power of the Führer and his party. What the film, however, will share with the Christian salvational narrative is then the idea of a fall leading to redemption and rebirth, and also the focus on an individual messianic figure as primary agent of the salvational process. The place, however, of the Christian emphasis on charity is now taken by the unabashed commitment to and exaltation of struggle, power, and violence. Hence, the importance throughout the film of militarization. To triumph, the Nazi will requires nothing more nor less than the militarization of the masses. And this, as we see, or as we shall see in the scene I'll show in a while, involves forging them into a uniformed block, into what I would call a mass or massive Gestalt. This is already implicit in the style of inscription already discussed. It consists in the literal sense of the German word in something like Blockschrift, block writing, a writing composed literally of stone blocks. Written in stone is also a German expression that designates something held to be immutable. That's precisely what is at stake here. Christian salvation becomes political, and something is missing here. And in the form, it becomes political in the form of national immutability. This does not exclude change, to be sure, but it absorbs and instrumentalizes it. There's a second point, however, in which the historical narrative suggested here at the outset differs from its Christian origins. The salvation to come will not take place essentially in heaven, but right here on earth. And it will take place, in a certain sense, here and now, on a particular datable day, which marks the fourth and last date in the sequence, and also the transition from the prologue to the film proper, namely September 5th, 1934, the day that the film itself begins, and the day we read the final inscription on which Adolf Hitler flew once again to Nuremberg to muster the faithful. That was barely visible here. In German, Umherschau abzuhalten über seine Getreuen. The German, difficult to translate in its nuances, to hold a military display is hardly adequate. That was the English translation. To muster his faithful troops brings together the Christian ideal of the faithful, literally his faithful, seine Getreuen, with the political notion of mustering, military notion, again literally reviewing or inspecting the troops, Heerschau. For all of its momentous presence, Hitler's voyage to Nuremberg, however, was explicitly designated in the preceding inscription as a return. Flog wiederum nach Nuremberg. And this return is highly overdetermined. Most immediately, it recalls that this is a second coming. It's the second time that Hitler and Riefenstahl have gone to a party conference in Nuremberg. 1 year before, Leni Riefenstahl had already filmed the 1933 party congress there, which was released under the title Triumph of Faith, Triumph des Glaubens. For the second time, however, faith has now been replaced by will, and this in a very particular sense. For only 2 months before this rally, the most faithful, perhaps, and certainly oldest part of the Nazi party apparatus, which had served as its armed wing throughout its struggle for power, namely the SA, had been decapitated in what came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives, but which the Nazis themselves referred to, and it is still often referred to that way, as the Wurmputsch. Ernst Wurm, head of the SA, represented the radical, more socialist wing of the National Socialist Party. And for him, as he declared after 1933, the seizing of state power was only a step and a means to the institution of further-ranging anti-capitalist socialist changes, or social changes. In short, for Wurm, the National Socialist Revolution had only begun with the seizure of power, whereas for Hitler, it had become imperative to normalize the power up to a point so that it could consolidate its rule with the help of the Reichswehr, the army, and with the help of the barons of German industry and finance. In 1934, therefore, the triumph of the will also meant the triumph of the SS over the SR, of Hitler over Wurm, of normalization over revolution, right-wing revolution. Given the historic role played by Wurm's SA, however, in the rise of the Nazi Party, the question of who the true faithful really were, the Getreuen, had to be very much on everyone's mind. The return, therefore, of the Führer to Nuremberg is also the moment when he will muster his troops, hold that Heerschau, to make sure that he still commands the loyalty of the some 4 million members of the SA, whose leadership he had eliminated barely 2 months before. And the moment of rebirth can also be understood, therefore, to mark the elimination, the violent elimination, execution, of the radical, proletarian, social revolutionary wing of the Nazi Party, which now faced the task, as I say, of consolidating its power with the help of the German military and industry. To be sure, watching the movie today, none of this background is immediately visible in the images and sounds filmed by Riefenstahl, although many, many allusions to these events are made in the speeches of Hitler and the party functionaries. But shadows and clouds through which Hitler will fly in arriving at Nuremberg also suggest the dangers he has recently sought to overcome. None of this is explicit, but in the initial context in which the movie was made, they provide the background against which the images would be seen and heard, at least by a contemporary audience, in Germany at least. This is also why the clouds that first surround the plane in flight, and into which it then descends, losing sight of both the sky and the earth below, are finally traversed and then allow the rooftops of the city below to come into view. The plane is both a product of technology and an instrument of power. And this is perhaps why Riefenstahl includes the plane in the images and sounds that she shows. The film and the vision it presents is made possible politically as well as technically only by the power of this relatively new means of transportation, which is part of the same technological development that produced the film camera itself. Technology records and transmits, and in so doing can be seen as transcendence brought down to earth. This is also why Riefenstahl will proudly claim to have introduced the traveling shot into documentary film. It's not enough to film movement or to film moving pictures. The camera itself must be on the move, although, for instance, in a very different way from Berthold's Man with a Camera, which would be interesting to compare. After panning across the clouds, plane and camera descend slowly into them, as I say, briefly losing view of the sky before suddenly showing the roofs of Nuremberg emerging below. The clouds have provided a reassuring protective cover for the descent from the sky to the earth. Towers appear, first of the cathedral, then of the castle, emblems of church and state, contrasting with the darker, modern, inchoate forms of the airplane fuselage we have just peered through, but also at. You can see the rivets if you have a good projection of it. As the plane descends ever lower and the details of the rooftops emerge more clearly, the sort of anodyne musical accompaniment dominated by strings is suddenly replaced by brass and woodwinds playing the music of the horse vessel song, Die Fahne hoch, anthem of the Nazi Party. The song was named after and composed by a member of the SA, who was subsequently killed in street battles with the Communist Red Front. As the music of this song is heard, the scene shifts from houses to blocks of people marching in the streets, an image that echoes the first lines of the song, which we hear, the music, not the words, namely an English translation, with flags on high and ranks in tight formation. SA is on the march with brave, determined step. My translation, since the journalists insist. It is the formation of these ranks, however, tightly closed, die Reihen festgeschlossen, as the German says, that epitomizes one essential aspect of the images seen in this film, and which is also to be remembered as a hallmark of depictions of fascism more generally. What I'd like to point out, however, in the context of our conference, is that there is a connection, I believe, between the fascist and Nazi emphasis on unity, uniformity, and homogeneity, and what Kant, who's not responsible for this, wants to define as the formal element in an aesthetic judgment, which I've already quoted, and which involves the unification of a manifold or a multiplicity. The massed blocks of marches, whether civilian or military, create that uniformity that is already, I want to argue, prefigured in traditional aesthetic concepts of form and figure and Gestalt. I want to make sure that it's clear what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting is that something like fascism and Nazism could only have developed the power that it developed if it were able to mobilize for its purposes elements that are deeply, deeply ingrained in traditions that long antedate. And that the tendency of contemporary, a certain type of contemporary history to precisely to isolate and personalize and view in a kind of Manichaean type of isolation, these phenomena completely paves the way for their return. Because you don't understand at all how they could mobilize their power. And it's only by making the connection. This is not to say that Kant is a predecessor of fascism. I hope that's clear. But in a certain, because Kant, more than almost any other philosopher, allows the contradictions to emerge of this tradition, but he is still indebted to a notion of form, which I believe feeds into this notion of Gestalt, with itself is not reducible to military masses, which contributes to it. Taken literally, a Gestalt is that which is set into place. It is gestellt in German. To set something in place, however, requires, first of all, a movement of setting, and second of all, a stable place into which that setting can come to rest. To the extent to which that which is thereby set into place is considered to be constituted independently of the process of setting in general, it can become a model or paradigm for a notion of self-identity that can be applied to subjects as well as to objects, to collectives as well as to individuals. In this case, the process of Gestaltung, which is the German equivalent of artistic creation, shaping, is indeed the heir to the theological connotations of the English word. The artist, by the way, there are thoughts in this direction very much developed by Lacour, Labarre, and Nancy in their little booklet, The Nazi Myth. So we have a relation between a notion of aesthetic creation and what he calls national aestheticism in other places. And de Man also has similar thoughts in other essays. The artist and a fortiori his or her artwork are both considered to be what they are above and beyond their spatial, temporal existence and manifestation, which in turn is regarded as a function of the pre-existing essence of the artist. One forgets or overlooks the dynamic process of being set into place, or the extent to which that multiplicity that is then fixed into a uniform unity and takes on the appearance of being self-contained. And I believe, I don't make this clear enough in this version of the paper, that Riefenstahl's emphasis on movement and the Nazi emphasis also on movement, in part tries to emphasize the process of Gestaltung rather than taking for granted the Gestalt. For example, the biologism of Nazi racial ideology then sees that as a kind of fulfillment of a predetermined sort of natural given. So you still have a process of Gestaltung that involves struggle and conquest and violence, but it's governed, as it were, by a kind of national teleology, which is that underlies the notion of race. It is this complicity and its promotion to traditional aesthetics, I believe, that Walter Benjamin had in mind when, at the end of his essay on the work of art, he associated the aestheticization of politics with fascism. What he meant by that often quoted phrase emerges more clearly, however, when it is related to another passage, one which introduces the final section of his essay, but which has not received the attention I believe it deserves. Benjamin's phrase, one could say, has served as a screen memory to block out the context from which it draws its significance. Here now is the passage I'm referring to, and that's quote 5 on your sheet. Benjamin writes, "The increasing proletarianization of people today and the increasing formation of masses are two sides of one and the same occurrence. Fascism seeks to organize the newly developed proletarian masses without touching the property relations they seek to do away with. Fascism sees its salvation in allowing the masses to express themselves, or giving them expression, but not to have what is rightfully theirs. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to grant them self-expression by conserving those relations. Consequently, fascism leads to the aestheticizing of political life. All efforts to aestheticize politics culminate in one point: war." Although Benjamin nowhere in this essay mentions the films of Leni Riefenstahl, he refers instead to the Wochenschau, the weekly film news. Much of what he describes throughout his text, and in particular in these passages, is epitomized by her films, and nowhere more perhaps than in Triumph of the Will. Benjamin, author of a seminal text, a fragment, entitled Capitalism as Religion, in this published article, links fascism with the religious promise of salvation of the masses. Fascism finds salvation in granting the masses self-expression, but only insofar as this expression can be linked to the conservation of existing property relations. This, in turn, entails what could be called, Benjamin does not call it so, I would call it the hypostasis of identity structures. People are what they are by birth, by culture, by nature, by race. And they should be then permitted to express what they are in their identity, themselves, but not to change themselves, rather to fulfill themselves through self-expression. In a footnote to this passage, Benjamin cites the enormous influence of the weekly film news, the Wochenschau, in providing such self-expression, above all through its images of masses in political and sporting events, monster rallies, etc. Such hypostases of existing self-identity, sporting event, by the way, is a good example. You go to a sporting event as a partisan, to identify with the team in general, and to sometimes an incredibly violent degree. Such hypostases of existing self-identity is closely related to the process of isolation as described by Freud, and its privileged medium is that of screen memories, but also what I am calling here the aesthetic Gestalt, insofar as such forms and figures are presented as being essentially self-identical and immediately meaningful and intelligible. Literally meaningful, full of meaning. To look at them is to understand immediately what they mean. There's no need to look elsewhere, much less to think of their relations to anything that does not immediately appear. One particularly significant form of this Gestalt, involving the self-expression of the masses, can be seen in precisely those blocks of marchers, seen from above, from what Benjamin, in the same long note, calls the bird's perspective, Vogelperspektive. The pure immanence and self-identity of this, a perspective which Riefenstahl often uses. In fact, she constructed special cranes in order to be able to take shots from above, looking down, as well as looking up, and so on. The pure immanence and self-identity of this mass, which makes it an ideal figuration of the kind of identity required by bourgeois and capitalist property relations under fascism, namely an identity that is above all considered to be homogeneous in the sense of owing nothing to anything foreign or alien to its immediate history. All of this is figured by and in the closed, compact formations of faceless and yet highly mobile marchers. The mass is moving with direction and purpose. It has a goal, and that's also why it needs and depends on a leader, Führer, to lead it toward the goal. And its compactness suggests that it will be impervious to any outside influence. In this sense, the expression, Ausdruck, that Benjamin associates both with fascism and with capitalism presupposes some similar sort of internal immanent identity that pre-exists contact with the outside world and can therefore be literally expressed, pushed outward, as it were, but not constituted by its relation to the outside world. In their footnote to this passage already mentioned, Benjamin provides a valuable hint concerning another aspect of the expressivity that he attributes to fascism, and in particular to its use of images in film. And this is the last short quote on your sheet, 6. In the great parades, the monstrous meetings, in the mass events, sporting events, or in war, which today are all performed in order to be recorded by the camera, the mass looks itself in the face. In German, sieht die Masse sich selbst ins Gesicht. In view of the rest of the scene, in which Hitler descends from the plane to the jubilation of the massed bystanders, the question of the face as the object of self-expression can be described more precisely. For there are multiple kinds of faces, the jubilant, ecstatic, but still multiple faces of those gathered to welcome Hitler with a fascist salute, among which many women, and the face of the Führer, calm, almost shy, as he descends from the plane, overwhelmed by the welcome he receives. In the automobile that takes him from airport into town, there are repeated shots from a camera in back of Hitler, where one sees not his face, but the back of his head, with the hand raised in this characteristic salute, a kind of silhouette. The clouds have long since dispersed in order to make way for this procession of the bright sunlight. But what seems crucial here, and relevant to Benjamin's notion of expression, is the interaction of the mass of spectators with their leader, whose face and figure sum up the kind of expression that is to be granted to the masses in order to perpetuate existing property relations and at the same time give them a sense of possible salvation. Those relations require a notion of the subject capable of owning property, which means ultimately capable of staying the same over time, in control of oneself, and thereby capable of existing as a distinct owner of what is proper to them. Properties in the dual sense of the word, involving the lawful possession of things and objects, as well as possession of one's own faculties and actions. The tightly knit ranks of spectators and the erect figure of their one and only leader can claim to resolve the question of multiplicity and unity, of transience and duration. As Rudolf Hess will put it in one of his speeches during the Congress, Adolf Hitler is Germany and Germany is Hitler. But why then should war be the beginning and end of the fascist aestheticization of politics, as Benjamin argues? Why should violence be involved? Chapter 7 of Riefenstahl's film gives us at least a partial answer. Maybe we can look at that now. It's not chapter 7, sorry, it's chapter 10, section 10. Section 10. It begins with the same image. Interesting, by the way, I haven't had a chance to do this. It's extremely interesting and illuminating to compare whatever the German Wochenschau did at the time, assuming they had sort of somewhat similar images of the voice off saying, here, Adolf Hitler, marching and so on, with Wochenschau. The clip recalls the beginning of the film. First, a black screen, short, soon followed by the eagle perched on the swastika, which then fades, this time, however, into a long central alley, through which, from on high at a great distance, seen from a great distance, the three tiny figures of Hitler, flanked by Himmler and Victor Lutzer, with their backs, and in turn, advance through rows and rows of SA and SS troops, 120,000 in all, toward an uncertain goal that in the next shot will be revealed as a burning flame, honoring German soldiers killed in the First World War. As the most direct confrontation of the political rally with death, this is also the most solemn moment of the 4 days, leading up to speeches by Hitler and Lutzer, in which the elimination of Worm and all of his leadership will be justified, the killing of the leadership, execution, and at the same time the SA as organization will be exonerated of its leadership's guilt. They were accused of preparing a putsch against Hitler. What is expressed on this occasion is nothing less than the will to triumph not only over the enemy, in this case actually the internal enemy of the world leadership of the SS, but I believe over death itself. By killing Wurm and his comrades, the German Weber is to be assured. Killing and the military, in the form of the SS and the Reichswehr, will pave the way to eternal life, to the 1,000-year Reich. The commemoration of fallen comrades thus goes hand in hand with the celebration of death that, as the result of killing, is treated as the product of an intentional act, one that can be deliberately inflicted, and by implication, therefore, deliberately overcome, if not avoided. War, as organized, collective, and purposive killing, makes death into what it has been considered to be ever since the book of Genesis, and also since the death of Christ, namely, the result of human action, whether as punishment for transgression, the original sin, or for betrayal. By acting in a manner that seems to make death into a product of human actions, politics in general, and fascist politics in particular, but not only, seek to make good on the Pauline promise quoted by Hobbes in his Leviathan, quote, that since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15, quoted by Hobbes. Also, to be sure, for Paul, that resurrection had first to be the work of a very particular man, namely he who was also the Son of God. And this is precisely the difference that separates Christianity from fascism. For the latter, it is the semi-divine, Führer, or Duce, who must assure the overcoming of death through the problematic but essential equation of people with messianic leader. The leader is an individual whose individually both sets him apart from, isolates, and at the same time makes him the expression of a collective that can now be construed as a homogeneous individual, members of the same race, of the same culture, of the same nation. This collective is modeled on the individual in the literal sense of being thought of as being homogeneous and indivisible. The individual can thus hope to live on in the collective, which in the case of Nazism understands itself as the bodily, fleshly continuation of its individual members through the continuity of blood. But this in turn requires the collective, the race, people, or nation, to close ranks in a dense and closed fashion, to quote the Horst Wessel song, in order to exclude all pollution and contamination from external and alien sources. This is the biopolitical version of the nation, modeled after the unshakable, invulnerable individual. And this individual is manifested as an object of faith and belief in the figure of the Führer, in the Führer as Gestalt, and in the Gestalt as Führer. The ideal of an indivisible, invulnerable, and ultimately immortal collective, symbolized in the stone eagle, but more generally also in the figure of the fasces, or that of the swastika, can only exercise political appeal to the extent that it can claim to control anxiety by giving it direction. The figure functions in this film often as a Markstein, a stone marker, directing the gaze and allowing it finally to set itself in place and to come to rest. In other words, allowing it to focus. The great obstacle to such focusing is, of course, death. The flame, framed and controlled by stone, and by stone-like troops, is one way of focusing on death, which then becomes a transition to eternal life. This absorption of death into life as a moment of transition continues a motif, therefore, as old in Western culture as the Bible and as the Christian salvational narrative. But the absorption of death into life also implies a transcending of finitude, which in certain political and historical contexts can converge with the rejection of heterogeneity. It's only when the origin is thus purified and made self-identical that the end that awaits all living beings, qua singular beings, can be represented not as an interruption, but as a fulfillment. Only then can death lose its sting. An essential component of this project is, I've argued, the representation of death as a result of human action, as a result of intentional activity. It is this that makes war a privileged medium of politics through which the political collective finds salvational self-expression. War legitimates killing, and in so doing makes death into a sacrificial moment of rebirth. But it is above all the death of the other that is here intended. Carl Schmitt's theory of the friend-enemy grouping as the origin of the political demonstrates its Christian origins, except that it is never humanity as a whole that is saved, but only a particular people, nation, or race, a self opposed to other selves, and this means opposed to other peoples, other nations, as well as individuals. But these others are nowhere to be seen in this film. They are screened out to begin with by the clouds into which and through which the plane descends on its way to its destination. Like the clouds in the opening scene, which are framed in the window of the plane. The clouds themselves into which the plane disappears, if only to exit on the other side, emblematize the transitions from one shot to the next through fading and overlaps. Such frequent fade-outs and fade-ins establish the cinematic sequence, giving it an underlying continuity of movement that is characteristic of Riefenstahl. This does not exclude the sharp cut, the fade to black, which emphasizes contrast and discontinuity, but it does highlight the continuity of the overall progression. It's this continuity which includes and absorbs the radical breaks that mark the German rebirth, linking the aestheticism of Riefenstahl's film to the violence of Nazi politics. It is, however, a violence that Nazi leaders assume and even flaunt. But in order to assert the perennial character of the new order, they are in the process of imposing. The sinuous rhythms of Riefenstahl's traveling shots constitute the cinematic correlative of the immortality implied in the idea of the 1,000-year Reich. The aim of conquering new Lebensraum by military force is the spatial condition of this promised extension of Lebenszeit. The clouds to which the plane descends to Earth are the movable gestalt that mark the trajectory of this promise, a theological promise brought down to political Earth. That's the end of this section. Now I have a short section, which I realize has been going on for a while, but that will take us now to 9/11.